and Resistance, Narratives and Interventions. For those of you who returned for the second day, and also indeed from this afternoon, hello again. And those who are here for the first time for this conference event, a very warm welcome to you. My name is Surya Madok, and I am Professor of Political Theory and Gender Studies at the London School of Economics and also the head of the Department of LSE Gender Studies. Together with my colleague, Professor Claire Hemmings, I co-lead the Network on Transnational Anti-Gender Movements and Resistance, Narratives and Interventions. The research of the network is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the LSE Knowledge Exchange and Impact. The network maps the narrative building blocks, the political grammars, conceptual vocabularies, rhetoric, figures and temporalities of both anti-gender ideology interventions and the political struggles and solidarities engendered in resistance. In foregrounding a focus on concepts and narratives, the network aims to develop a transnational methodology which can help us draw out how these anti-gender mobilizations work, with the aim of generating more robust tools for resistance to the take-up of anti-feminism for right-wing agendas. This two-day conference, and indeed, this final event this event is a final event of the two-day conference, which we've been conferencing since yesterday, and is organized by Claire Hemmings, Alyosxa Tudor, and Senel Wanarishi, and myself. And I've been told that you can follow us on Twitter, which is X at, Twitter is called X, right? Sorry about that. Yes. AHRC_gender, and use the hashtag LSE AHRC gender when tweeting about this evening's keynote. Before I introduce the speakers, and it would be my absolute honor and great pleasure to do so, but before I do that, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on one of the key themes of the conference that we've been talking and thinking collectively since yesterday, which is the transnational. The transnational in this transnational network does very important pieces of work. Even though it has become now almost a catch-all term in academia, the term transnational, everybody I turn around seems to be using it, it is in fact very hard to engage in transnational work. Not least because it must be multi-sited and multilingual, but also it requires an absolute refusal of methodological nationalism. In light of violent racial, imperial, carceral borders and national visa regimes, it's been inordinately hard for colleagues on this network to travel to the UK from different parts of the world. And even though we have taken the network to Latin America so that our colleagues in South America, that it would make it easier for them to be in conversation, it has been very hard to get colleagues from outside, from different parts of the world to the UK itself. And this is why we are so inordinately grateful to Tuba Said, who was one of our keynote speakers yesterday, and to Professor Matebeni for being here, because we know how hard it has been for them to actually get here into Fortress UK, Fortress Europe. The transnational, of course, also means that we have an obligation to extend transnational solidarity in the face of extreme imperial violence on our colleagues in different parts of the world. So it's not something that people can and ought to or should take lightly when they use the word transnational in their work. And this also means, in that moment, standing up for their academic freedom and safety. In the opening remarks to the network, yesterday morning, which is when we opened our network, some of you who joined us right in the beginning, some of you might have kind of come in much later, my colleague Claire Hemmings read a statement from her and I as network organizers. And since we have moved venues today, and indeed institutions, to host the final event, I will reread that statement from her and I again. We wish to state, and this is from Claire Hemmings and I as network organizers, we wish to state our distress and horror at the war on Palestine and the ongoing genocide. We are devastated at the targeted killing of so many colleagues and the destruction of all universities in Gaza. We call on the UK higher education authorities to condemn this epistemicide and to substantially extend scholars at risk programs to bring our Palestinian colleagues to safety. I am now going to introduce our brilliant colleagues. And it is, as I said, my great honor and my great pleasure to have this chance to do so. Some of you, not all, but some of you might have noticed that there's been a slight change to this evening's order of events. And that's actually been on account of the illness of one of our speakers. And I'd like to also sort of say that I'd like to wish both Claire and I would extend our very best wishes to Jules Gill Peterson for a full and swift recovery. So let me first then, before I go on to the order of events, let me introduce our speakers this evening, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Professor zethu Matebeni, on my right, is a sociologist, activist, writer, documentary filmmaker. She holds the South Africa Research Chair in Sexualities, Genders and Queer Studies at the University of Fort Hare. She has held positions at numerous universities, including Yale, the University of Western Cape, and the Institute for Humanities in Africa, and at the University of Cape Town. She has been a recipient of a number of research fellowships, including those from African Humanities Programme, Ford Foundation, the Fogarty International Centre, and the National Research Foundation. She is actively involved in queer activism in South Africa. Professor Matebeni's poetry and essays have been published in numerous journals, books and blogs, including blacklooks.org and avid.org. In particular, her wide-ranging and influential writings include those on cultures of sexualities and gender in Africa in changing nations, queer bodies in African films, foregrounding Ubuntu, decolonisation and deconstruction, art activism in decolonising a South African university space, non-normative vocabularies, and on the death and the modern black lesbian. Her documentary films and scripts written for those include Breaking Out of the Box, Stories of Black Lesbians in 2011, and she's the director of Rise with Aliki Saragas in 2013. And now, to my left. Alyosxa Tudor, of course, needs no introduction to those of you who are at SOAS. Alyosxa Tudor is a reader and associate professor in gender studies at SOAS, University of London, which is where we are this evening, and is also the chair of the Centre for Gender Studies. Their main research interest lies in analysing knowledge productions on migrations, diasporas, and borders in relation to critiques of Eurocentrism and to processes of gendering and racialization. They have coined the terms migratization, migratism, and have been arguing for a critical differentiation, migratization, migratism, and racialization, racism, for more than a decade. At the moment, Dr. Tudor is working on their new monograph project, which is titled The Endurance of the Mare on the Histories of Resilience and Sexual and State Violence in the Eastern Europe Borderlands of Gender in Europe. And this is imminently forthcoming with Duke University Press. So now to the order of the evening. So this is how it's going to all pan out. Professor Matebeni will speak for about 35 minutes. And after which there will be a response from Dr. Tudor for about 24 minutes. Let's settle on 24 minutes. Okay, fine. And then once that has been done, there will be, Professor Matebeni will provide a response to the response. Right. And then we will have about 35 minutes for Q&A. Okay, so, and after the Q&A is over, there will be a congratulatory reception for both the speakers and also for you, the brilliant audience, later, which is just outside here. Okay, so I don't know about you, but I'm excited to begin. So let's go for it. Zethu, go for it.
Hello, everybody. It is good to see you all, and thank you for braving the rain and coming out tonight. It was in July 2022 when Sumi and Claire invited me to join the network. Alyosxa has been trying to get me to SOAS since January 2018. Thank you all for your persistence. It is a great pleasure and honor to meet you in person and to be in conversation with you, Alyosxa, and to share space with all the committee members of the network. I must admit, Sumi and Claire, that when I first got the invitation in 2022, I was ambivalent regarding my involvement in the network. Naming what was going on in my part of the world, anti-gender, seemed a bit odd. It made me wonder what role gender plays in our society and the kind of power we put on gender to mark everything that we are going through, bearing in mind already the critique of gender from African feminist scholars. At the same time, being aware of how concepts, terms, and thinking travel from place to place, remaining uninvolved in this network presents its own risks. And so, here we are. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you to Sanel for arranging my visit here, and your constant offers of support, and thank you to Violet for the work behind the scenes. The work of transnational solidarity, as Sumi has already said, is laborious. It is also about finding common ground, listening, learning, feeling together, and working together, or learning from each other. Kamako. We are never alone. This is an African practice and method to recognize and call upon those with whom you journey. Yesterday, after the first session, I was sitting in the lobby at LSE, and I was overcome by a deep sense of isolation and loneliness. And I had to think, why am I feeling this? Surrounded by all these scholars on gender. And it made me think, well, perhaps it is about the moment of arrival in a place that kind of decides how you should be or who you should be in the world. And when you enter that space, you realize, actually, I never belonged here. And so I had to reach out to friends for support and for care in thinking about this isolation. And they appear in my text messages as sources of comfort and courage. Asanda Benya, Pumla Dinawokola, Henriette Gunkel, Babala Makotwana, Mamadi Matlako, S.N. Nyek, Jabu Chen Pereira, Swati Shah, Princess Sebanda, and Azrini Wahidin. This text that I'm going to present today is an extract from the thinking processes that Peace Kibua and I share. It is not complete. It is an attempt to a queering of a South African history. And I offer this because I know there's a lot of focus on South Africa at the moment for good reason. But there's also other moments we have to think through in terms of what is going on in South Africa and how South Africa and other parts of the continent, of the African continent, engage with each other. The mythical bird, or the mythical Sankofa bird, while firmly grounded, has its head looking backwards, fetching an egg with its mouth. Akan tradition invites us to focus on this symbolism and this image of a bird carrying the future while looking to the past. Theoretically, this is quite enriching and draws S.N. Nyek to argue in their new book, Africana Queer Presence, that Sankofa, and I quote, is a moment of deep contemplation where all directional aspirations collapse in the realization of the puzzling complexity that the image of Sankofa itself evokes. A present with necessary returns and life-bearing transformational paradigms for individuals and communities, unquote. I take the cue from this invitation of Sankofa, and through this talk, make necessary returns to history and unravel a narrative often sidelined in the annals of South Africa's queer history, a narrative entwined with the intricate tapestry of sexual and gender politics across the African continent, as enshrined in South Africa's constitution and other continental laws. The prevailing tendency to isolate South Africa's historical trajectory from broader African experiences marked by slavery, colonization, racism, apartheid, and the post-apartheid era fails to capture the interconnectedness of these shared struggles. While the focal point, as I will present, is the South African landscape starting in 2023 and moving between periods, the overarching theme advocates for a queer historical lens that takes the intricate relationship between South Africa and Uganda into serious considerations. The term queering, as I employ in this presentation, signifies more than a mere descriptor. It serves as a methodological approach, encouraging a fresh perspective in how we read, think, write, and engage. Within this context, queering acts as a catalyst for an alternative viewpoint, unsettling the normative narratives that have traditionally framed discussions on South Africa's sexual and gender politics. It prompts us to explore a nuanced understanding of South Africa's history, one that acknowledges the intersecting struggles of gender, race, class, citizenship, and activism that echo throughout the continent. The methods, lenses, and challenges posed in this presentation foreground significant work by queer African scholars, including Kegure Macharia, who demands that we probe the relationship between archive and method, Esenyek, who urges us to negotiate with history, including the history of post-colonial queer negations and possible futures in the now, and Hugo Gakenam, who begs that we allow for more capacious lenses to attend to how we queer and are queered. Thus, the use of the term queering here is intentional, distancing itself from the prevailing trend that employs queer as an all-encompassing umbrella term within the ever-expanding LGBTIQ+ acronym. It goes beyond the reliance on non-heterosexual sexual identifications and extends to the ways in which actions or positions can challenge larger normative systems. This approach is particularly salient in the African context, where the term's broad usage may inadvertently overshadow distinct experiences and unique challenges faced by lesbian, transgender, and intersex individuals. By deploying queering with a critical lens, the aim is to inquire into the present moment and challenge the boundaries of what is conventionally accepted as normative. Through queering history, we acknowledge the limits of the colonial and post-colonial archives, and we revel in these gaps. So if we understand queering as a challenge to heteronormativity and an exploration to alternatives to conventions, social orders and norms, then it is fitting to begin queering this queer history of South Africa with a focus on the Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni. In the last decade, Museveni, following in the footsteps of Zimbabwe's former president, Robert Mugabe, and a few other African leaders, has been on the minds and tongues of many Africans and people worldwide. Not only has Yoweri Museveni been in power in Uganda since 1986, challenging all those opposing his domination, but his stance on homosexuality has also sparked controversy. Citing scientific evidence in February 2014, Museveni signed into law the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which had been debated in Uganda's parliament since 2009. While this law did not last more than six months, it reintroduced heavy criminalization of same-sex sexual conduct and any distribution and promotion of homosexuality. Almost 10 years later, in May 2023, the Anti-Homosexuality Act No. 6 of 2023 was signed by President Museveni. Discussions leading to the president assenting to this law, and this is important, these discussions pertained to family, culture, what it means to be African and Ugandan, as well as the protection of children from homosexuality and homosexuals. While President Museveni returned the bill for amendment because it criminalized people based on appearance, signing it into law conflated homosexuality, same-sex acts, and LGBTIQ persons as a whole, thus implying that all groups under these categories cannot enjoy their rights and exercise their freedoms. Parliamentarians argued that homosexuality was a push from the West, forcing Africans and Ugandans to distance themselves from their values and cultures. As one member of Parliament, James Kaberuka, stated, and I quote, "This is the time to defend Africa and what we believe in so that we can define ourselves and our destiny." Close quote. It is perhaps Museveni's standoff with another African leader, Julius Malema, that animated African politics and debates on same-sex sexuality in 2023. Malema, the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, an opposition party formed in 2013 in South Africa, is a former African National Congress Youth League president. In just a year following its inception by Julius Malema, the Economic Freedom Fighters swiftly ascended to become the third largest party in the parliamentary landscape. The party positioned itself as a champion of economic justice, advocating for land expropriation without compensation and nationalization of key industries, especially mining. Malema's EFF has upheld the legacy of African nationalism, echoing the ideological cornerstone and guiding principle established by the ANC Youth League back in 1948. Malema's denouncement of Museveni's Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2023 was a surprising departure from his usual alignment with African leaders who vocalize resistance against Western influence. And I'll come back to that a bit later. The Anti-Homosexuality Act, No. 6 of 2023, represents one of the most extreme legal measures against homosexuality, imposing severe penalties on individuals engaged in same-sex relationships. The offense of homosexuality carries a life imprisonment sentence, while promotion, or what is considered promotion of homosexuality, through various means, including print, financial support, organizing, or property rental, can result in up to 20 years in prison. Attending or participating in same-sex marriage is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And the death penalty is prescribed for what is deemed aggravated homosexuality. Fines or imprisonment up to 5 years are mandated for anyone not reporting knowledge of individuals committing or intending to commit homosexual acts. Beyond its legal ramifications, this act has inflicted profound societal damage, leading to breakdown of families and forcing people to flee Uganda. It has invited violence and prompted a witch hunt against citizens. In response to this oppressive law, Julius Malema, in South Africa, orchestrated a protest march to the Uganda High Commission in Pretoria, South Africa. And this was in April 2023. The EFF march not only contested Museveni's draconian legislation, but also broke new ground by addressing sexual politics in ways unprecedented for political leaders of Malema's stature. In the realm of gender and sexual politics, Malema is not an uncomplicated figure. In 2006, during the former President Jacob Zuma rape trial, where Zuma raped a black lesbian woman. Malema defended Zuma by insulting women in South Africa and downplaying the severity of the rape epidemic in the country. Similarly, Malema has shown significant support for former President Robert Mugabe from Zimbabwe, a vocal critic of homosexuality. Surprising to the general public was the EFF's decision during its 10th anniversary celebration in July 2023, merely 3 months after his protest march, where he invited a staunch supporter of the Anti-Homosexuality Act to deliver a public lecture in Cape Town. Malema justified this choice by emphasizing the importance of diverse perspectives and expanding discourse. Consistently embroiled in controversy, Julius Malema has wielded significant influence over the discourse shaping African politics. He has a huge following. From his fervent advocacy for land redistribution without compensation to his unapologetic condemnations of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism, Malema's public declarations, as their proposal notes, reverberate through the collective consciousness. In parallel, his unabashed critiques of the African National Congress and its leadership have been instrumental in unveiling the layers of corruption and adverse conditions that occasionally define the political landscape. In the tumultuous year of 2009, amidst the controversy surrounding the South African athlete Caster Semenya, Malema emerged, along with Winnie Mandela, as a vocal supporter, publicly aligning himself with her cause. He even went on a hashtag, "We are all Caster Semenya." However, his stance went beyond a mere endorsement, delving into the intricacies of sex categorization. Malema's impassioned argument centered around the contention that the imposed categorization of Semenya should not override her inherent identity as a woman from a village in Limpopo. This is a province in South Africa. In stark contrast to the swift labeling of Semenya as intersex by the international community, Malema asserted that local traditional methods of identifying children at birth had already affirmed Semenya's status as a girl. According to Malema, these local practices required no further scrutiny. You can read Ifi Amadiume's book on this idea of identifying the status at birth. By subjecting Semenya to public humiliation, the International Sports Federation underscored the enduring examination placed on black women's bodies, revealing the influence of Western ideals of femininity. The fact that Caster Semenya was African, woman, black, and excellent was perceived by the Western Sports Federation as peculiar. In the realm of queering, the West's perception of Semenya as divergent from the norm of being a black African woman can be viewed as an endeavor to pathologize or deviate from the African understanding of gender and sexuality. Racist in its intentions, it reflects an attempt to challenge the fluidity of identities and complexities woven into the fabric of African existence. Asserting Caster Semenya as woman, black, African, and excellent is a queering resistance against rigid categorizations. It is an acknowledgement of diverse intersectional identities and lived realities within the African context. I'll go a little bit to some anthropological and historical studies. How much time do I have?
You have about 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. 15 minutes, okay. Then, okay, let me do the whole thing. Anthropological and historical studies documenting same-sex sexualities or other non-heteronormative practices have provided empirical evidence of diverse expressions of sexuality and gender identity on the continent. You probably know some of these. For example, the edited volume titled Boy Wives and Female Husbands, Studies of African Homosexualities, documents a diverse array of traditions and practices that illustrate expressions of desire, relationship, and identity not neatly contained within the rubric of heteronormativity. From the gender-defined homosexual roles in the region of East Africa, to the mixed and cross-gendered healers and spirit mediums in Angola and Namibia, to the same-sex practices amongst the Hausa in West Africa, Murray and colleagues argue that the sexualization of Africans by European settlers must be understood in tandem with a moral logic that simultaneously rendered Africans as inhuman, as well as sexual practices as taboo. In South Africa, the mining compounds and urban prison industries have further provided vibrant debates regarding sexual and gender expressions amongst men. For example, Niehaus and Moody cite an early documentation from 1912 regarding same-sex sexuality amongst minors in Johannesburg. These scholars provide a contested reading of the different sexual and gender practices within this context. For example, they argue that male-male sex practices within the compounds was influenced by a wage economy that necessitated for some men to seek to earn extra by acting as wives to other men. These earned income would further facilitate the payment of ilobola, or bride price, back home to their women. Moody's thesis and others, their thesis was that expressions of male sexualities on the mines was in many ways expedient for miners to preserve income as well as health concerns. Their findings were corroborated by many other scholars, including Harriet's documentation of male sexuality on mines in Johannesburg. And other scholars have noted the influence of a culture of imposed celibacy, as well as cultures of sexual aggression and rape that found expression in male-male sex practices, both within the compounds and in prison. Niehaus offers this really extended history of this phenomenon of mines. Still within the context of the migrant labor system and the control of African labor since 1893, other scholars have documented, or Epprecht in particular, documents a 1941 report which found that some Basotho men, or miners from Lesotho, participated in what he calls ingochane, male-male sexual relationships. The same report found that instances of public cross-dressing and same-sex marriage ceremonies were practiced. As important as these early studies are to documenting early forms of sexual and gender expression, activists such as Zaki Ahmad caution against some of these studies in their emphasis on establishing cause and effect. His concern here is that questions of desire and pleasure become sidelined in favor of reading non-heteronormative sexualities in terms of causal logics. Similarly, I'm in agreement with Magadla Makokwane and Mutseme's assertion of the importance of reading sexual and gender histories in Africa in tandem with local histories and kinship ties that provide contextualized understandings of sex and gender's fluidity and diversity. And one such is marriage, which, as we know, is a significant institution that allows us to offer an understanding of culture, family relationships, and various societal elements. But the impact of colonialism or colonization on African marriage practices is evident in the struggle between customary laws and colonial laws on marriage. And in his book, Queering Colonial Natal, T.J. Tully argues that marriage, while it may be seen as normative, it has queer potential. Tully is correct to read the practices of ilobola and polygamy as queer or inherently destructive social formations. In the 16th century, prevalent assumptions dismissed the possibility of sexual intimacy between women, leading to a lack of serious attention to women's relationships. This perception persisted into the 20th century, notably in parts of Southern Africa where woman-to-woman marriage and same-sex intimacy were observed. And despite efforts to dissociate homosocial intimate arrangements and same-sex marriages from the concept of homosexuality, woman-to-woman marriage created ambivalent spaces where same-sex desire could exist. By the late 19th century, urban subcultures, especially in Europe, North America, and some parts of Africa, began to shift views on same-sex intimacy and marriage globally. And so I find it's important to talk about the institution of woman-to-woman marriage, because marriage comes up a lot in these debates around the Anti-Homosexuality Act or how not to be particular bodies. And yet, This institution dates back to the 18th century, and despite facing decline due to Western and Christian influences, it remains prevalent in African societies. Woman-to-woman marriage plays a central role in creating or enhancing kinship structures. In this practice, a woman assumes a role of a female husband, taking another woman as a wife and becoming a social and legal father to her wife's children. Women strategically use woman-to-woman marriage to enhance their social and economic positions linked to the challenging status of the female husband when a wife is taken. The practice challenges gender norms by allowing women to assume a gender position of a man, granting them rights typically reserved for men. In countries including Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, legal challenges have recently arisen as women-to-women marriage cases are taken to court, as recent as 2014. Through the assumption of the male gender, female husbands as men were able to elevate their gender position, as well as status through attaining social power, even though some people argue that power was ultimately conceived of as male. So the expression of power, characterized as masculine in woman-to-woman marriage, unfolds similarly in contemporary same-sex marriages. Within a patriarchal and heterosexist framework, an implicit notion persists that one partner, often the man, is imbued with male power or assumes the role of husband. Similar to woman-to-woman marriage, the functional roles in contemporary same-sex marriage are detached from sex stereotypes. This practice was also prevalent in institutionalized friendship marriages among men, such as those observed by the Nzima in Ghana. In these settings, as you've heard, a man or husband could either be a man or a woman. It didn't matter. And a wife could be married to a husband who is not biologically male. And this is the similar context that you find in Southern African minds where a wife could be biologically male. And so we also have the practices of women in South Africa who are becoming or training as izangoma, traditional or indigenous healers. And we observe an intersection between the male gender role and the role of ancestors and the personal desires of isangoma. And in these experiences, we find that isangoma, given the role that you are given by your ancestor, regardless of your ancestor's gender, you are then called to take up an ancestral wife whose gender may or may not be similar to yours. So women-to-women marriages, same-sex marriages, and ancestral marriages continue to play important roles in contemporary society and provide insights into the fluidity and challenges associated with gender roles, gender identity, status, and same-sex relationships. So on the one hand, there's this huge landscape that we have to navigate as Africans in terms of understanding how we fit into the gender paradigm. And at the same time, there's going back to what is going on in contemporary politics. So I move now. The pain of the people of Uganda is our pain. So while there are many players shaping South Africa's queer politics pre- and post-apartheid, it is undoubtedly curious, as you can imagine, including Malema into this picture. So during the April 2023 march to the Uganda High Commission in Pretoria, Malema not only challenged Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act, he also called for solidarity with the people of Uganda who are persecuted as people in other nations. His passionate calls for international solidarity echoes a broader struggle against discrimination, particularly within the context of South Africa's history. The legacy of colonization and apartheid, characterized by racial and gender oppression, also extended to the LGBT+ community. Highlighting Malema's speech outside the Uganda High Commission in Pretoria in April 2023 aims to draw attention to the contentious history that continues to influence the recollection of South Africa's queer politics. Notably, this historical narrative has predominantly centered on men and men's sexual relations. So, including Malema and Museveni in querying the historical narrative, is querying this historical narrative while simultaneously filling in the gaps by offering an intersectional lens in querying South Africa's history. And I want to quote Malema's speech. And I'm sure you'll find it very interesting. Julius Malema. I'm here to say to the comrades and the people of Uganda, we are with them against the tyranny because we cannot allow any regime in the world to kill people on the basis of identity. We are victims of identity politics. We were killed because we were black, and the only crime we committed was being black. Today, all those who are being killed in Uganda is because it's a community that belongs to the LGBTQ+. We are here to say to Uganda, as long as the LGBTQ+ community is not free in Uganda, we are not free. As long as the people in Palestine are not free, we are not free. As long as the people in Cuba cannot trade anyhow they want with anyone they want in the world because of the economic embargo imposed on them by the imperialist America for more than 60 years, we are not free. As long as the people of Swaziland cannot choose who is going to lead them, but some king out of drunkenness decides who must be a prime minister in Swaziland, we are not free. We are free if the world is free, because we are part of the globe. The pain of the people in Uganda is our pain. When we go to Uganda, we don't need a visa, but when they come to South Africa, they need a visa, yet we are one thing. When we say to you, we don't want borders, we don't mean excess control and regulation of the people that are in this country. We simply mean there must not be visas amongst ourselves. So many countries in the world come to South Africa without a visa. But when we say the Ugandans must come to South Africa without a visa, you xenophobic people said, no, we don't want them here. Yet, there are countries of white people who come here without a visa. International solidarity is what made us where we are now. People all over the world fought for our freedom in what we call international solidarity. The people of Uganda are now saying to you, we ask for your solidarity because we are about to be butchered. And we're asking for South Africa, let's stand firmly behind the people of Uganda. So that was Julius Malema. I'm sure you've got to like him. In Malema's rhetoric, two pivotal themes resonate, delving into the heart of South Africa's realities: violence and xenophobia. While intricately intertwined, these themes often cast a shadow over LGBTQ+ issues. The violence directed at LGBTQ+ individuals is frequently examined in isolation, neglecting the interconnected nature of various forms of violence. Similarly, discussions on xenophobia tend to overlook the intersections of gender, sexuality, and violence within the context of citizenship and freedom of movement. Acts of violence against women, the queer community, and African non-nationals in South Africa are widely acknowledged. However, what often diverges is the lens through which these phenomena are comprehended and scrutinized. The multifaceted effects of colonization, apartheid, racism, and sexism converge to shape the experiences of LGBTQ individuals in South Africa, intermingling with the boundaries of citizenship and notions of being African. The context of xenophobia in South Africa is a socio-political and legislative issue, reflected in the repealed Aliens Control Act 76 of 1995. Preceding this repealed law was an act deeply rooted in historical legislative frameworks that perpetuated discriminatory practices. The ACA, or the Alien Controls Act, inherited its foundation from the Xenophobic Aliens Act of 1937 and the 1913 Immigration Act, These historical laws were characterized by deeply ingrained racism, homophobia, and xenophobia. In the post-apartheid era, the ACA's provision contradicted the spirit of inclusivity enshrined in the new constitutional order. The systemic discrimination embedded in the ACA marginalized transgender individuals in particular, illustrating the interconnectedness of xenophobia and discrimination based on gender identity. The violence faced by asylum seekers and refugees in South Africa has not been surprising, given the legal frameworks that contributed to their marginalization. In the context of LGBTQ rights in Africa, South Africa emerges as a highly sought-after haven due to its unique standing. And I'm sure now it's a haven also for people in Palestine. It remains the sole country on the continent to successfully establish positive rights and full legal equality for LGBTQ+ individuals. Central to this achievement is the South African Equality Clause, playing a pivotal role in ensuring that lesbian and gay individuals, along with their relationships and families, enjoy full citizenship. Over time, the scope of these rights has extended to encompass transgender individuals. For example, the Alteration of Sex Description Act, or Sex Status Act of 2003, provided legal protections to transgender individuals. But despite the comprehensive legal frameworks in South Africa, significant challenges persist in achieving full social and cultural integration for LGBTQ individuals. Particularly, which means?
Maybe a minute and 20 seconds.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, actually I'm done. So I talk a little bit about what happens in terms of and drawing a lot from Kaminga's work on what happens to transgender individuals who come to South Africa, given that they see South Africa as this haven. But so despite the legal freedom of movement within South Africa, transgender refugees grapple with societal expectations, conflicting with the challenging reality of their lived experiences. The journey for trans refugees transcends geographical boundaries, involving the delicate navigation of societal attitudes, common sense interpretations of gender, and the quest for acceptance. While legally granted the freedom of movement in South Africa, the social landscapes transgender refugees traverse are fraught with challenges, including the pursuit of acceptance and visibility, negotiation of perilous family and community networks, and grappling with economic precarity. So, the narrative of violence against African queer individuals in South Africa is intricate, revealing itself as a profound storyline complexly woven in the social structure. The act of associating homosexuality, which includes, in the African context as it plays out, gender diversity, gender identity, and queerness. So the act of associating homosexuality with a Western way of life plays a pivotal role in creating a sense of distance, preventing African individuals from fully embracing and asserting their Africanness. These assertions, which cast a shadow on the authenticity of being African, queer, and trans, can be traced back to colonial legacies that have deeply ingrained the perception of Africa as inherently opposed to the notions of sexual and gender diversity. In essence, the violence experienced by African queer individuals becomes not only a contemporary issue, but also a manifestation of historical forces that have shaped societal attitudes and prejudices. So, in this return, I am left to ask, how then can queer and trans Africans shape a future that will transform their lives in the present? And to use the words of Binyavanga Wainaina, as queer Africans, we must free our imaginations. And to do that, you have to go into the offense to make new things. And that is the offense I'm looking to discuss with Alyosxa today. Samako.
Wow, such a privilege to listen to you, Zethu. Thank you so much for this wide-ranging and actually a very deeply moving talk this evening, and for seamlessly bringing so many of the themes of the network also together in your talk this evening. So thank you so much on so many different levels. So I'm now going to pass it on to Alyosxa, who's now going to respond to you. And after that, I'll come back to your response to the response. Okay, right.
Thank you so much, Zethu. Just a word on language and pronoun use. So what I'm doing is, you will see I use a mixture of your first name and your last name.
Yeah.
And I use the last name when I refer to you and the first name when I use it as pronoun. And when grammar totally fails me, because the possessive pronoun comes then twice in the same sentence, I use they as a generalist pronoun form, just to make that clear. I'm so privileged to be able to be in discussion with you today. This is not really a paper, but rather a collection of thoughts that deeply relies on the knowledge and inspirations and challenges we shared over the last 2 days. And mostly it builds on some of zethu Matebeni's extensive oeuvre, as I'm lucky enough to share the stage with you tonight. I would like to draw out 3 different theoretizations zethu offers across their work and connect them to the topic of this conference, anti-gender movements and resistance. Very centrally, zethu's work engages with the question of what gender is. It includes a critical reflection of Western colonial terms and translation. In the article Vocabularies of the Non-Normative, for example, published in 2015 together with Thabo Mzibi, they carve out how gender is an Anglo term that has become a not innocent, lingua franca spaceholder that requires careful, historicized, and situated. Yeah? Sorry, I can also come closer. I can also make an effort. Where am I? Yes. They carve out how gender is an Anglo term that has become a not innocent, lingua franca spaceholder that requires careful, historicized and situated processes of meaning-making, deconstruction and translation. They make clear, I quote, "Destabilizing the normative standards that are used to limit how we speak and name ourselves is a necessary eruption." End of quote. Across many publications, zethu examines with necessarily painful attention to lived realities the ways violence disrupts the lives of dykes, queers, trans and gender non-conforming people and women. This violence comes in layers of misogyny and queer and transphobia with racism, class, and regimes of white supremacy. Black queers constantly negotiate visibility, safety and space and are often subjected to deadly violence, zethu underlines in their theorization of pride and the politics of race and space in Johannesburg and Cape Town, published in 2019. Building on Bibi Bakare Yusuf and Vasu Reddy, Matebeni and Mzibi, in their introduction to a special issue on non-normative sexual and gender diversities in Africa in 2015, point out the interlinkedness of pain and resistance. Loss, mourning, vulnerability, and death are not mutually exclusive to desire, sex, and pleasure, they state. And the third strand, again, not disconnected from the ones I mentioned just now, in zethu's work on decolonizing the university, decolonizing knowledge, and decolonial pedagogies. Discussing the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movements from a queer feminist perspective, zethu emphasizes how trans and queer student groups were crucial to challenging the masculinist, cis-heteronormative mainstream of the decolonization movement. It becomes clear through zethu's work we need to decolonize gender studies if we want to begin to learn to understand what the subject even is. But moreover, what Matebeni points out here is that queer and trans feminist approaches specifically give the decolonizing movement an important theoretical foundation. Zethu's works offers deep-reaching, engaged and complex theoretizations that we can forward for our project here on the resistance against anti-gender in a transnational context. One of the insights I would like to underline is that for the work we're doing here, it is crucial to examine what gender even is, namely a category that is always already transnational, trans in binaries and in translation. Indeed, Matebeni's rich interventions provides ways and worlds that enable us to go beyond gender as a pre-given category. Building on this scholarship, in an article for TSQ in 2021, I argue that a decolonial perspective on gender means conceptualizing the category of gender as always already trans. My object of investigation is gender as a category and gender studies / transgender studies as a field of knowledge. In order to carve out what decolonizing transgender / gender in Europe could mean, I bring different strands together that have been held apart before. Resistance against global attacks on gender studies, resistance against transphobic feminism, and attacks on the decolonizing the curriculum movement in the UK. A lot of the UK media representation on the decolonizing the curriculum movement is hostile. Not only the right-wing press, but also many liberals are outraged and accuse the movement of essentialism, anti-male, anti-white, anti-Western resentments, and even racism. Knowledge, as the tenor of the argument goes, is neutral and gets deneutralized and re-racialized through the decolonizing movement. It is actually the white English people who are the colonized, and the imposition of decolonizing is the actual colonialism. To scholars who are used to anti-gender argumentations and this type of gaslighting, these accusations will seem very familiar. The attacks are of a similar viciousness as the anti-gender attacks and, as I want to stress, the students, so it's mainly driven by the students, of course, the decolonizing movement. The students and the academics who are involved in the decolonizing movement are not gender studies scholars either. In November 2023, the ex-UK Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, in her resignation letter to PM Rishi Sunak, almost too clearly reveals the discursive lines that are being mobilized globally. She calls ceasefire demonstrations hate marches and regrets to not have been able to fully implement her agenda to restrict migration even more so that the attempt to cross borders will kill even more people, to crack down on human rights and international law, and to impose anti-gender and anti-trans measures on education institutions. It becomes clear that one populist culture war argument here is working to strengthen the other, and resistance must pay attention to this acceleration and react with unwavering solidarity. Especially leftists who think anti-gender and transphobia is that silly little thing that we will be dealing with after revolution do not see the writing on the wall. As also Lamble pointed out yesterday, not only the right attaches to anti-gender politics. This is particularly clear when looking at anti-trans and so-called gender-critical arguments within as well outside of feminism. The connection is one that pivots the trope of protecting women to secure agreement, and this trope also serves as a common denominator between left and right. Based on fueling phantasmatic fears of the trans predator, anti-gender shares this trajectory across the political cleavage with anti-immigration. Another typically right-wing topic that has been taken up in the UK and across Europe by left-wing populisms. Partly as a response to scholarship denouncing this overlap with right-wing thinking, gender-critical individuals and groups increasingly insist on their leftist affiliation. We witness a remarkable affective dimension, as Hemmings points out, that often accompanies gender-critical contributions, the uttering of regret about being forced to turn to right-wing platforms or politics as they feel cancelled by leftist media or student activism. However, of course, despite all that whining, gender-critical feminists continue to be very successful in placing their content in traditionally left or progressive media outlets. Miriam Tichting and I have suggested to focus on the analysis of right-wing times rather than right-wing agents to make it possible to go beyond an approach that defines gender criticals as necessarily right-wing or fascist, and rather ask about the discursive conditions in which discriminatory ideologies like anti-gender and transphobia can can become part of leftist and or progressive agendas. Trans-exclusionary feminists are using the trope of protecting women as their main weapon while accusing trans-inclusive feminisms of misogyny. It is a rhetorical figure that we can call the weaponization of accusations of violence. And we witness it as a strategy cutting across many contexts. For example, blanket accusations of anti-Semitism against anti-Zionists, accusations of Hinduphobia to shut down resistance against Hindutva, and accusations of misogyny and sexual violence against transfeminism. The interplay of accusations of violence and claims to vulnerability always works to split progressive movements and to consolidate the far right. Analytically, we witness a twofold mechanism. First, violence is located in the resistance against Zionism, Hindutva, and transphobia, while the violence of Zionism, Hindutva, and transphobia is denied. Second, this distracts from the actual location of violence, the spheres in society where anti-Semitism, racism, and misogyny thrive. This strategy makes these power relations indiscernible to such an extent that it becomes impossible to fight them. With this, the accusation of violence by trans-exclusionary feminists against trans people and allies is inherently anti-feminist. It protects and fosters violence, factually doing the contrary of its own claim of opposing violence. We know that. And still I admit I'm being caught in interpellation. How can I critically reflect on the fact that I cannot help myself but react to the "Hey you" by trans-exclusionary feminism being addressed by those who supposedly speak for women or even lesbians? Our refusal of their terms that comes with exposing the violence in their terms also means to resist their claim that they are the feminism, that they are the ones who fight for women's liberation, or that feminism is only about women's liberation for that matter. We are told that trans-exclusionary feminism cares about women's liberation or fighting sexual violence. Yet the recurring strategy of externalizing sexual violence and describing it to the pervert other, trans women, gender non-conforming people, migrant men, Muslim men, black men, etc., is shared across transphobic, migrantist, racist, and Islamophobic debates. They overlap in the idea that sexual violence takes place somewhere else and will be invited in through plurality, migration, and weak borders, what Miriam Tichting aptly calls sexual violence as the language of border control. We find ourselves in a global political moment, right-wing times, in which anti-gender and anti-trans feminism is going mainstream and shamelessly grooms people into joining in the name of seemingly innocent promises of women's liberation. One of the intentions of my own work and research in resisting the interpellation of terms that construct us as violent and instead being loyal is resisting the interpellation that constructs us as violent and instead is being loyal to the careful, power-sensitive, complex, sometimes contradictory and painful analysis queer and trans-feminist theories have taught me. And we are faced with the fact that power relations come in conjunctures. They vary in form at the same time as they appropriate knowledge from social movements and adapt to resistance. In other words, transphobes only can accuse us of misogyny because of the decades of knowledge we produced that made it possible to call out misogyny. But while they did not learn anything from us how to historicize, analyze, and fight misogyny and sexual violence as intersectional with other forms of oppression, they have appropriated the linguistic capacity to call it out that we have generated through our work and weaponize it against us. One of zethu's recent articles from 2021 brings several strands together, and I would like to draw out some of its specific insights. It is titled Non-Gai Indod, Non-Gai Indod, Moving Beyond Gender in the South African Context. Zethu invites us to read with her, three different text occasions in which the term non-Gai Indod, an Nguni term for gender fluidity, operates in opposition to mainstream interpretation, offering, as Zethu meticulously carves out, an opportunity to go beyond Western gender binaries. Combining in their analysis dimensions of interpolation and resignification, it becomes clear that the term does the work to refuse what I call elsewhere the labor of misogyny, while existing beyond the confines of gender. It can be used for women resisting male violence and for gender non-conforming people alike. Importantly, Matebeni brings resistance against misogynist violence together with the rejection of ascription of gender deviance, but rather provides a focus on celebration of fluid genders in resistance. Zethu explains, I quote, "We have found ourselves reflected in borrowed terms, Western languages and gender relations that have packaged our existence in dichotomies, limiting our experiences and expressions. Non-Gayendod and transgender occupy similar zones, although differently. Non-Gayendod does not occupy the space within. It is a powerful form of existence," end of quote. I'm one of the scholars claiming in an article we need to decolonize the field of European Western gender studies. So my question here now is, how do we do this and from our specific locations? Say, in my case, in my role teaching gender studies at SOAS with the limitations of my own positionalities as a migratized but white, queer, transfeminist scholar. Awina Okech reminds us that it is important to assign and cite African feminist knowledge production not only for teaching focus on Africa, but as a generalist expertise in gender and queer studies. Can we extract a political and epistemological claim for decolonized and transnational transgender studies / gender studies and imagine the term non-Gayendod that Zethu theorizes would come to have an international career like political and identity-based Anglo concepts like lesbian and trans, or epistemological and political traditions of thought like queer with origins in the US? What would non-Gayendod theory help us to understand about the entanglement of non-normative gender and sexualities and their connection to racialization, the possibility of rejecting the labor of misogyny shared across different gendered positions, and about resisting the violence of colonialism and decolonial or Western nationalism alike? I'm not suggesting here, of course, for Western white-dominated academia to appropriate Zethu's work, but rather intend to remind us of the colonial travelling or non-travelling of these terms and the variability of the dominant meaning that is attached to them, as also Matebeni and Msebi in their 2015 piece underline. And of course, Professor Matebeni's work needs to be central to any generalist gender studies canon. To conclude with a discussion of what academia owes political activism, I would like to turn to the question of what to do with the fact of being at a public institution right now in the UK, a country highly complicit in the genocide in Palestine, and countless colonial mass murders and genocides in the past. How can we make sure decolonisation is not a metaphor, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang remind us? How can we mobilize histories and the theories and epistemologies generated from them in ways that are not reductive, simplistic, and incapable of sitting with the complex contradictions that still need responsible and decisive actions in the face of present-day injustices? As Walaa Al-Qazia has pointed out, queer is unthinkable outside of the question of settler colonialism and its shaping of everyday life. Al-Qazia underlines that it remains a necessary task to recenter Palestine and its geopolitical / geocolonial specificity in this debate. Like this call to always include a focus on a critique of settler colonialism into queer studies, S.A. Smythe suggests thinking of black non-binary method to make clear that trans studies and black studies are not two different fields. They make clear that for understanding what trans is, we need to always center blackness and questions of racism in our analysis of trans. Bridging together Al-Qazia's and Smythe's point, gender studies are unthinkable without taking seriously the question of colonialism and settler colonialism, racism, imperialism, and conquest. And we might want to extend that analysis to the question of settler colonialisms in the Americas, Africa, and Australia, for example, where the blood spilled by genocide is already cold and not exceptionalize Israel. Just right now, And right here, it is our duty to speak up and demand to stop the ongoing genocide in Palestine from continuing. We are being asked, don't stop speaking about Palestine. I gave a paper in Frankfurt, Germany on November 30, 2023 on trans studies in Europe. I said, as of now, the death toll in Gaza has surpassed 15,000 with more than 35,000 injured and over 1.5 million displaced. Vital infrastructure has been obliterated. This is on top of the tens of thousands Palestinian deaths and injuries and dispossessions that occurred before October 7, 2023. I gave a paper in Birmingham, UK, on January 26, 2024, on trans queer studies in the UK. I said, as of now, the death toll in Gaza has surpassed 25,000, with more than 64,000 injured and over 1.5 million displaced. Vital infrastructure has been obliterated. This is on top of the tens of thousands Palestinian deaths and injuries and dispossessions that occurred before October 7th. I speak to you today and I'm asking, is there a point to me saying, as of now, the death toll in Gaza is 30,000? It is quite clear none of my previous papers has saved a single life. However, knowledge production and the functioning of power is one of the tools we can use to fight the functioning of power. Discourse is not reality. And of course, it is only one of the many arenas where we direly need to coordinate our solidarity and resistance. The culture war is very much about extermination, as we have long known. Anti-migration rhetoric, for example, helps to kill people in their 100,000s trying to cross borders. I'm going to make a controversial point, given the fact that people like to binarize academia and activism, but connecting to Sayed's call for us starting to organize, I would like to claim that this conference network, thanks to Sumi Matok and Claire Hemmings and all of you, is a gathering in which we organize. As I was bound up in interpellation by TERFs before, maybe this is now the time, and I think we have done this over the last 2 days, to go beyond what our attackers think gender studies is and towards defining what the broader field of gender studies can be. Can it be a field of knowledge generation that aims for decolonization? What does it mean to think of gender studies as a field that engages with geopolitics, with transnational knowledge production, with histories of entangled oppressions and resistance movements? How can we be accountable for our very different structural positions in this quest in terms of location, post-colonial/colonial position, migratization, queer and transness, class and racialization? Can we continue building a field that accepts and grapples with the challenge that comes with the question of how to take responsibility for complex entanglements in past and present geopolitics? Often this is complex, contradictory and painful, but it must also be clear that taking a stance is necessary. I quote Tuba Sayed, who said yesterday, "In order to take one of us down, they have to take all of us down." Thank you.
Zethu, over to you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Alyosxa. There's so much that we can take from your words, your moving plea, and the call to not stop speaking about Palestine. Perhaps where to start is to follow where you started, to think about language. And I'm thinking about this in terms of how you are asking us to think about decolonizing gender studies and what that would mean and what it would look like. And I think one of the starting points is really the issue of language. Not only on the place, thinking about the place of pronouns, which for many people whose language is not binary is problematic, because we are again forced to state who we are within the binary, and thus actually distance ourselves from who we are. So I'll give an example. My name is zethu Matebeni. The last part of my name, zethu, is a pronoun. And so to be called a she, or it or they, is problematic, because what it does, it erases what the pronoun in my name already says about who I am in my family and in my society. So when we have to talk about this idea of gender, we already have to think about how we are positioned, as you were saying. And so having to think about this constant erasure of having to stand alone. And that's why I wanted to start by saying we are not alone. Even in my name, it calls for all the people that come with me. Zethu, ours, belonging to us. So it cannot be me. Yes. And that is an important starting point that I think we can unravel in many parts of the world, to figure out how to, in decolonizing, how to create a new language. And the important part of what you are saying is that, and I take this quote from you, they did not learn anything from us, okay, and used this against us. So, in this language that we have not been able to create yet, we've allowed for those who are working against us to use a limited language to hurt us. And that's what you're saying. They did not learn anything from us, which means that our ways of knowledge creation also need to shift. And to also find different vocabularies and different registers of knowing and a new language to engage with what it is that we think is gender studies going forward, or what it is that we consider to be gender, because it is the thing that has now come to harm. But at the same time, I'm aware that that requires extra labor, and I take the cue also from the session earlier today, where Gail was talking about, about politics of care, or the practice of care rather. So how to make sure that we don't do this extra labor. So it requires a kind of strategy of, what is the strategy of decolonizing gender? That is not exhausting. Yeah? And this is where, again, imagination comes in. How do we free our imagination so that we are speaking a new language, and a language that can liberate all of us, and not come back to be used against us. Okay. So I think, the other thing interested in hearing you mention is this idea of innocent promises, particularly because of the global political moment we are facing. So, and I hear this notion of innocent promises because what it's asking of us to do is to be alert to the ways gender is understood and how it's unpacked, or this anti-gender movement unpacks. So this alertness requires a new kind of awareness. So a lot of the rhetoric that we hear sounds beautiful sometimes. I mean, I was talking about Julius Malema. You would be convinced of his stance, right? And this is where I see this innocent promise, this innocent promises, where that take us in, and if we don't have the kind of alertness and awareness of what it is that we should be looking for, we can easily be consumed and shifted to the other side. And so, and be constructed again as violent. So I'm thinking about this innocent promise and how beautiful it can sound. And also taking from the panel earlier, how it itself can seem as pleasure. So I suppose what I take from you is also what I would like us to think about is what new forms of alertness do we need to be aware of this current moment? Because it's not so easy to understand. It's very sophisticated sometimes. Yeah. Thank you for your words.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Q&A. I'm going to now invite questions from you all, because I'm sure you've all been waiting to ask questions to Professor Matebeni. And I think you can also ask questions to Dr. Tudor too. Well, that's totally fine. You can say yes. So please, we've got about half an hour, and I think we could steal about maybe 2 or 3 minutes over, but that's about it, right? But we've got about, say, half an hour for Q&A. So I think that if we are very efficient and very good at this, we could actually manage to do 2 rounds of Q&A. So could I get a sense of the questions that are there, that are waiting to be asked? So if you could just put your hand up, I'm not going to ask you at this moment, I just want to get a sense of how many questions there are in the room. And then I know that how then we can sort of organize and manage our time. So I see Sonia, I see one more hand there, so I see 2 and right at the back, so there's 3, and is there one more? And Violet as well. And then there is one right there. So, okay, so in that case we've got 4 questions, haven't we? Plus Violet. Yes, so 5 questions. Okay, right. Okay, in that case, I will take those questions. So I'll take them. Yeah, so I'll take them in that order. So first Sonia, then going there second. Yes, please, just there, and then right at the back 3, and then 1 there 4, and you 5, Violet. But can I suggest that? Let these be questions as far as possible. So, really as succinct and brief as is possible. And also, if you could very quickly say who you are, not an existential exercise at all, just who you are. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Testing, great. All right.
Hi, good night. I'm Sonia Correa from Brazil. I have a very direct question to Matebeni, but before that I want to thank you both for the incredible reflections you brought to finalize, to end these incredible 2 days of sharing and establishing connections and modes of solidarity. And Matebeni, my question is brief and direct. How is the queer movement and feminists in South Africa reacting to the rhetoric of Malema? What is the impact it's having in the queer and the feminist movement?
Thank you, Sonia. And just there in the black shirt, please. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm Lynn from China and Hong Kong, lecturer in sociology at Open University. And my question is about regarding the translation of gender and the ambiguity you talk about gender at the very beginning of your talk, as well as at the very end, how we can imagine that freedom of imagination from, I guess, more or less, it's a translation from English to other parts of the world that we are really being ambivalent about. And I can also see that in the translation of gender in terms of Chinese activism and scholarship. as well as the term queer, how we both embrace it well as still feel so ambivalent about it. So, yeah, thank you. And thanks for the deeply moving talk from both of you.
Thank you, Len. And then there's a question right at the in the last row. Thank you.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Will, a MA student at Goldsmiths. And my question, I'll try to be as brief with it as possible, is I suppose I want to hear a little bit more about borders. It feels a bit like throughout the talk we've had the border almost emerge as a site of the production of bodies, or at least as some kind of authoritative diagram of the body. So what I mean is it seems as if frequently the border has stepped in to enforce kind of essentialized models or colonial models of gender in a way that mirrors gender assignment that you might experience. And so my question is, to what extent could the liberation of people in terms of gender and sexuality also necessitate the dissolution of borders, or at least kind of violent border regimes?
Thank you. Well, and then there's just one question just there. Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Anna Nenadovic. I'm a lecturer here at SOAS, and I've got, thank you very much for the exciting interventions, talks, and I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on digital spaces, social media websites, whatever, and potential and problems when it comes to gender issues, but also solidarity and movements that are cross borders. Thank you very much.
And Violet, it's your turn.
That actually seemed like a lot of questions. I'm happy to just pocket mine if you want to.
You get one question.
All right.
Get one question.
My treat. My question is actually about your remark about pronouns, because I was very struck that the act of misgendering, the misusing of pronouns, is often a very existentially painful thing to survive, to be repeatedly misgendered in that way. And I wanted to just see if you had some more to say about the, translation came up so much throughout the conference, and that seems like an incredibly radical and liberatory place to start. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your use of pronouns and sort of if you had any more thoughts on the pains of that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So it looks like there are one or two questions just only for you, and then the rest, I think they are for the whole panel. So maybe the first one is for you. I think it's about the rhetoric of Malema.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, thank you, Sonia. This is a weird thing, because as I mentioned, Malema appears as a very important figure in the South African landscape. And his party, the EFF, positioned itself as a feminist party right from the beginning. And they were very clear that they find counsel from feminists in the country, and they are queer inclusive, etc. And of course, one can, there have been challenges that feminists have found by being associated with the EFF. But these challenges have not been outwardly spoken or being presented to the public as actually this is not a feminist organization. And it cannot be, because it is about really one man. But also its ideas in terms of its policy, it's not really feminist, but it has radical ideas that some feminists attach to. So there is this weird relationship between both the queer, I wouldn't say movement, queer organizations and feminist organizations that attach themselves to EFF. But having to pay attention to Malema's rhetoric in this way has not been done. People are not having this conversation and saying, wait a minute, actually this is problematic. It sounds good, but actually we see behind it. We see what is, we see what is behind it. A lot of queer people were very moved by Malema because he was the only leader, actually in South Africa, who said something about the Anti-Homosexuality Act. And so they quickly attached themselves to the EFF. And we're going to see now, it's on the 28th of May, South Africa is going to elections. And of course, we know in Africa, when there's elections, the draw card is always on queer issues. And I'm pretty sure the EFF is going to ride on this idea that we were the first ones to actually speak out against anti-homosexuality. We're the first ones to talk about Palestine and to push our government to actually do something about what is going on in Palestine. So we do see all these, how the EFF is actually making use of itself or its politics in terms of, drawing in the numbers. But in actual fact, when you are within, you realize that it is politics at the end of the day. There is power, and it's always about unseating somebody, etc. And I think what is important is, as I was saying, is this alertness to actually really pay attention what is really going on. And for majority of the population, we don't do that. We're happy to just hear it, and it sounds good, and we go with it. Yeah.
Thank you. And there were questions by Lynn, Will, and Anna, which I think both of you will. I think they were addressed to both of you. So there was a question on the ambivalence, on the translation of gender by Lynn. There was a question on borders and the authoritative diagram of the body, which I thought was a really very nice way of putting it. And then there was a question on digital spaces and the potentialities, but also the risks of solidarity and organizing. Yeah. So do you want to?
No, Alyosxa must go first.
Yeah, I think we can. Sorry. I think we can do the digital space one very quickly. Okay. We're both not on social media.
Yes.
So,
yes, I was also freaking out that how am I going to answer this? But good, yes.
I'm just replying for the both of us. We have no idea. Sorry, but pronouns or borders. Maybe I start with the borders question or the migration question because I've worked for a long time on questions of migration and how migration shapes the Western nation state and how migration needs to be thought of, the regimes of migration need to be thought of as central to the functioning of Western nationalism, and that overlaps with the functioning of race, but it's not entirely the same, and I think that is an important thing to always hold race in the framework when we speak about migration. But not to assume that all migrants are discriminated against in racist ways in the Western nation state, and to be really specific about these overlaps. And I think that ties into a lot of things. Also, what you said as a response to what I had said, the question about being very specific in the face of complexity. So we're dealing with very complex discourses. And there is a need to have complex answers to that, right? And I think it struck me also in what you said about the migration and the question of xenophobia in the South African context as a central ordering mode of how the South African nation organizes itself in the tension of colonial/post-colonial white traveling or entering the country that is not coined as migration, and then inter-African crossing of borders that suddenly is coined as migration, that's suddenly coined as something that threatens the nation. And I think this is really important. Migration is not a category that's a neutral category. Migration holds hierarchies of power within. And so I think it is very important to keep that in mind. And in a globalized world in which borders exist, borders are the moments in which violence is inflicted on people, and not only deadly violence, but also deadly gendered and sexual violence, right? And I think that's one of the very important things to keep in mind when we speak about a context in which we are being accused of sexual violence and so on for being trans-inclusive. If people really cared about sexual violence, the first thing they needed to get rid of is borders, because borders is one of the main sites globally in which sexual violence happens all the time, right? And so if your goal in life is to get rid of sexual violence, which is a great goal, right? Borders would be one of the places to start, and there we see also the disingenuous discourse we're dealing with, of course.
So what other question can I respond to?
You can respond to the borders question if you wanted to, which is...
I think Alyosxa did a great job there, so I don't need to add.
You don't want to go out. Okay, fine. What about the question of ambivalence on gender translation?
Can you, that was Lynn? Yeah. Can you state your question again, please?
Thanks. Right. Because you mentioned about your ambivalence of using the term gender at the beginning when you accept the invitation from Alyosxa to attend these meeting, and also you stressed your loneliness yesterday of not belonging to this place, and that not belongingness I share very deeply as somebody from Hong Kong and mainland China, of course. But so you were also talking about, and I noticed that throughout your speech, you actually maybe purposely avoid using the term gender from time to time, whereas using many other terms, such as woman-to-woman marriage or male-to-male sex, and etc. So I was thinking that is it a purposive move to move away from terms such as gender or queer, because, well, in the debates in Chinese feminism, there's also this tendency to claim that it is not these terms or these concepts that are problematic. What is problematic is the positionality of knowledge production, that these terms are from English academia. And then it is because of these positionality that makes those terms problematic. So in a way, it is the English that is problematic. So I feel that as a scholar from Global South, that's the problem that we're all dealing with while still publishing in English. So, right. Thanks for the time.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Yeah, that's much clearer. Thank you so much. It is correct, as you point out, that in the first instance, it's the English that is problematic. But what actually that means is that once you start speaking English, as somebody who's colonized, yeah, you have to, English is a culture, right? So you already have to distance yourself from your own, yeah? So I have to, with the English culture already asks me to think in terms of a binary, to think in a particular way. And of course I have to succeed at this if I want to remain an academic. Yeah? And it can be a very frustrating thing. But you also have to at the same time, to show that you are an academic who's really invested in decolonization, you have to then translate what you offer back into English. But the English already is so limiting. So if I have to keep saying gender, 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 I mean, it's a nice word. Okay, it's easy. Yeah. But what does it actually do to me as the speaker? Yeah, and the person who has to, unfortunately, because of the culture, I have to kind of like embody it, you know, and also think, like, use it in a way that it asks of me to use it. I can't say I am Nongayindoda who is a gender, because they don't go together. Nongayindoda, the concept that I use for who I am and what my society allows me to be, has no gender. It goes beyond that thing. And so, you know, the language that I use automatically decides who then do I become and what my scholarship is. And so that is always the ambivalence, how to engage in this space of trying to, you know, to sound, I think Gail was saying legible, or legible to some extent, you know, to an audience, but also to remain true to myself and who I am. And I make an example. I mean, in my community, I am regarded as utatomkhulu, and that means grandfather. And so to be then, and that is not necessarily a gendered position. It sounds like it. It sounds like it, because I've had to translate it to grandfather, right? But it just means that I am the greatest of the fathers. So I'm not even the father. The greatest of the tatomkhulu, like umkhulu, like, you know, we call God nkulunkulu. So it's taken from that. And so to then have to come back and say that, you know, I'm a gender scholar, means that I also have to refigure who I am, so that I can fit into this idea of what gender is. So I'm always navigating this ambivalence. That's why you hear me sometimes not using it. It's the same as queer. Yeah. And of course, queer, I mean, I was listening to Tuba saying queer yesterday, and I could tell this word does not come easy. So in isiXhosa, queer does not translate to anything, but people have found, isiXhosa is the language I speak, people have found the closest thing to it, and that is, and I talk about it, square. Kwere. And kwere is a derivative of kwere. And kwere is a term that people use to show that you are an other, you are an outsider. Uli kwere. So when I say, oh, I'm giving a paper on queer politics, or my work is on queer, they're like, oh, queer. People can understand that. You are queer, but already it distances me from everybody, because it tells them that I am coming from the outside. And my interest is to be within you and to critique what is happening inside. So it is about, language.
Thank you. And Violet's question to both of you on pronouns.
Okay, let me start. Thank you, Violet. I'm very much aware that it is important for people for all of us to self-identify and not to be misgendered, and to make an effort into learning how we want to be named, what pronouns we want to use. So I want to thank you for doing that work. But also, we come from different places in the world. And part of the transnational solidarity is to hear each other from the positions from which we speak. And also, not only about from which we speak, but about who really we are and how we present in the world. And for me, that's important. It's beyond a pronoun. So I find it so limiting for me. I'm not saying, I know many people find it, I need to say I am so-and-so, he, she, they, etc. And that's important for them. But for me, it's important that I can tell you the history of my name so that you can always know that I, again, you see, I use we don't have this thing in my language because my name already is collective. So zethu appears as a collective of people. And so when I encounter you, already I need to bring everybody with me, and you need to see that. So, yeah, and I think it's also about location, etc., and movement. So people need to feel comfortable with their own pronouns and how they want to be named. And some of us, we don't have pronouns in the English because you're going to tell me that ours is not a pronoun. And for me, it is. Because my community thrives in calling me ours. Yeah? But grammatically, you can't say it. When you read my bio, ours is a what? Ours is based in South Africa. You can't. Again, you see, we're going back to this language, the English problem. Shame, I'm sorry to diss English, but ish.
It's also, of course, the question if we can embolden us to call you ours.
Good question. To whom do I belong? No, I mean, it's not. This question is actually not about me, the person that you are looking at. It's about the collective practice of trying to figure out who we are and who each person presents. You know, it's also about, you know, in the earlier panel, somebody, I think it was earlier, you were talking about humanity and humanness. You know, so from the place where I come, that is always collective. You know. And we even have a term for it, Ubuntu. You know, you're always talking. There isn't this one. You're seeing the body only, but actually, around me, there's so many energies and spirits that are always with me, and that is what we call the spirit of Ubuntu. That we have to collectively recognize that at all time. We even do it in our greeting. It's not hello, it is sanibonani. And sa means collectively, I see all of you. And you think, why are you saying sanibonani, but I'm one person? No, I see your history and your lineage. I see all of you. So, difficult work, man.
I don't think we can say anything that would match anything that you have just said to us. I think you've had us undone in this moment, and I think we all will need a minute or two to take in the gravity of what you've just said. So thank you for it. I think it's so important for us to feel the way that we feel, right? Because so much of the academic work is about actually not being allowed to be able to feel in the ways we do. In fact, I was sort of saying to someone that, everything just affects me, and I just kind of weep at everything, and and they would say, well, that's not a bad thing. And I was kind of like, but you can't do that in the UK Academy. You can't even say that. So this has actually been these 2 days of coming together and being able to sort of, be in a space and with all of us, right? With all of us, all the people who made the time, took the time, did the labor of sitting, showing up, appearing, doing the work, thinking together, eating together, making that time, and I think that has just been such a space of, a restorative space of sort of what Tudor Said called radical compassion, actually, and so really on what you've just, to the place that you've just taken us, and from where we've come since yesterday, I think all that's sort of left for me to sort of do now is to bring the 2 days of the conference now to an end, and to say that, but of course this is all farewell, right? Not goodbye, because this sort of work we continue, and I think you're absolutely right. How do we keep doing this work without being completely exhausted, without exhausting and burning out? But that's where we need the collective. And that's where the collective comes, because it doesn't let us fall. In those moments when we are falling, it is there to hold us and catch us. So I just want to sort of say that thank you for this, and thank you so much, Alyosxa, for your beautiful and generous response, and opening up so many avenues for us to think with so generously, and opening up zethu's work in this, and to get your fabulous response back was just incredible. So really, thank you, and my gratitude to all of you this evening. And as I said, these anti-imperial, anti-racist feminist spaces are precious, and I think we should hold on to them as much as we can. And in the academia, that's the spaces of organizing, I would say. So thank you very much. And there is a congratulatory reception outside for all of us here today, but particularly in the honor of Professor Matebeni and Dr. Tudor this evening. So thank you.